Good evening. You're listening to the Extreme Movie Show. I'm your host, Rob. Alongside me tonight, Professor Pixel. We are both broadcasting to you from the Central Florida area next to Walt Disney World. As a matter of fact, there's a place over here called Celebration, which reminds me, Pixel, of the Village. And why do I mention that? For two reasons. One, because I can, and two, we're doing the last episode on our show here of Extreme TV, where we go episode by episode of a TV show. And in this case, we're doing the final 17th episode of the first and only season of The Prisoner, starring Patrick McGowan from the late 60s. A show that, unfortunately, generally speaking, on a rewatch here with you for the first time for me in about 30 years. First half, pretty much genius. Second half, filler and a bunch of crap. But this last episode leaves us where the prisoner, who woke up one day gassed in a village, he had no idea where he was at, trying to figure out a way out. Spy stuff. The anti-James Bond, using his intellect, a little bit of luck, and not trusting women, would try to constantly make his way out of the village. But like the cover says, why are you here? I want information. What's your name? Who is number one? Who's number six? Blah, blah, blah. It's a very Britishy show, complete with lots of jazzy fist fights and other stuff from the late 60s going on. And I have to sit there and say, for the audience that reviews this and listens to it along with us, obviously the older crowd is fully aware of the late 60s being a time of a great upheaval society-wise, especially after World War II. You had a lot of boundaries kind of erased and recreated. You had socialism, communism, fascism, whatever you want to call it, in different areas of the country. And then you had certain things taking over in America and Great Britain, which led to hippies and peace protests and riots and all sorts of stuff. Basically, big, huge waves of this stuff across the world that still continues to this day. And Pixel, while you're the young 20-something here on the Extreme Movie Show, aka Extreme TV for tonight, you didn't go through any of that stuff, so you don't remember what would happen in the 70s with stagflation and car lines like I did and everything else. So when we sat down and said, let's watch something old and see what it is, the first thing that came to my mind was, wow, what a great show The Prisoner was, as far as having political themes, dealing with individuality versus it takes a village to raise a kid, to paraphrase a more recent political phrase and all that. And it turns out, like I said, about halfway through, it fizzled out for me. And I gotta say, upon further review, while I still think this is one of the greatest TV shows ever made one season, it would probably be right up there if just half these episodes were cut out. And while some of these filler episodes were mildly amusing and entertaining, this last episode, which is a two-parter, let's just say it's probably one of the first TV shows that had an ending that pissed off people to no end, which has gotten a little bit more commonplace today. And so if we think Amazon not allowing people to review their own show on their own platform currently here in 2022 is upsetting to a lot of people in the population, imagine what this would have been like if it had been broadcast on only 3 channels and it was hyped up to be the answer to everything that number 6 goes through here in the village, because we get answers allegedly to who number 1 is, but nothing else at all. And I think that's what pissed everybody off. So you can kind of tell where I'm kind of going overall with this episode here. And as a two-parter, let me ask you, what's your initial takeaway on what this episode was leading up to in season? What did you get away from it?
You know, there are words to a song. I tried so hard, and I got so far. But in the end, it doesn't even matter. This show, I have enjoyed it. I have. I won't lie. There have been episodes, and even episodes that I haven't cared for, I found something to enjoy. This one, while it still carries that overall vibe throughout it, it decides to go off the walls.
It's very British. She does it, doesn't it?
No, because Britishy, Britishy, to say that implies that everything British doesn't make sense. I see what they're going for here. I can tell.
Right.
But as I was going through this episode, I was just finding myself amused because it goes off the wall. You know, I know you don't care for Westworld.
The remake, correct.
The remake of Westworld, you don't
Who cares
care
about
for
robots?
Uh-huh. I feel the way you do that Patrick McGowan here, while he was an intelligent man, there's no doubt about that, he was trying to be intelligent in the way he was writing this. That's what it felt like. And I ultimately, like, we can go through it like we have for other episodes, but I really feel like it doesn't really matter. Because while, of course, number 2 is in here and he's enjoyable, it's just simply it's a mess. It's a mess, and with how it ends, it's not going to be satisfying. There's no satisfaction here. Number 1 isn't number 1. Number 1 is an idea, and I could have taken an actual villain. I wanted a real big bad, because otherwise, the entire setting of this, the genius of this, is hollow, because there's nothing real about it anymore. And when you're coming to watch a show, you want some sense of reality, that you want to believe that this exists in some manner, that you can understand it. And sadly, there's nothing like that with the end of The Prisoner.
Yeah, so where it leaves us is basically as a two-parter is number 6 and number 2 played by Leo McKern, who one of the big takeaways for me in this whole show is that it makes me want to look up stuff he's been in to see if he's as good in that stuff as he is in here, because he really jumps off at the screen. I think he definitely is one of the high points to it. He they had engaged in the last episode in the battle of will, so to speak, where they go through this like regression type therapy where Leo McKern as number 2 is playing the role of the superior versus the supplicant. So usually when you have a relationship where, who's in charge, if you know what your role is, that's fine. And number 6 was kind of brainwashed to accept being that, and maybe going through certain trials as he grew from a young age to an older age, which we dove into last week. It would be revealed why he resigned. And the answer allegedly we got was for peace of mind, which is a non-answer. It's almost like a non sequitur, and it could be true, it could be not. How would they really know? And so that's one of the faults, I think, with it, with the whole idea of it, is it's an intriguing concept. Hey, he's got knowledge that we want, but if you're really not trying to get it for a particular bigger use, then what the hell's the fucking point? And what's frustrating about this, when I say it goes Britishy, is, of course, in the last episode they got into a lot of Shakespeare with things, which might be lost on the average viewer looking for a spy show. And to me, this shows at its best. And early on, when we don't know who he is, so we see him fighting against the man, for lack of a better term, and a lot of counterculture, like used to use that expression back in the day of which meant the government trying to control what you did, and the government was never supposed to be a solution to problems. It was supposed to be, the smaller the government, the more liberty and freedom you had. And that American ideal obviously is what propelled America to be one of the most number 1 countries in the world, for however you want to take that, and people get insulted by it, than any other longer lasting, maybe culturally more aesthetic, and by some people's terms. And it's just a fact that that's how it is. And having that freedom allowed some people to do great things. And it's a shame that by the 60s people realized that big government really is the problem for everything, not a solution. And when we see characters investigating certain ideas like that, or just even if you dumb it down to what I use the phrase jazzy fist fights and different ways of escaping, it could just be a run-of-the-mill spy show where he's trying to get out. How's he going to do it this way? How's he going to do it next week? It was cool because we met certain characters along the way. We even see the vertically challenged butler in this episode kind of almost act like an ally in a way, while they take out a bunch of guys in the final big jazzy fist fight at the end as they escape. And ideas are only good if you have people that you care about, or at least care one way or the other about, a villain or a bad guy, black or white, not these shades of gray stuff. And because they've gotten away so much from number 6 and who he is and what they want with these last 4 or 5 episodes, I thought, okay, last episode we were going to get on track here for what's going on, and we're let down. So what happens? Some argue that number 6 is number 1, that you're a prisoner of your own mind, that you create your own prison. You see the world through your own eyes, and it is what it is. And it seems like a cop-out. And your comment about it trying to be intelligent, I get it too, and I don't disagree with that. and I appreciate that, but it's nebulous enough where certain logistics and mechanics of it pissed me off. So turns out, there's a few demonstrations when the quote unquote jury decide to let him know that he's passed the tests and all this other crap. You're like, what? That's it? They'll give him a passport anywhere. He can leave. He can stay. He can do whatever he wants. I get it, but it's not like the balloon popped. The balloon just deflated without making a sound, because eventually, you see them back in London, and you see them driving on the outskirts of London, which is still a very massive city back in the 60s and going back hundreds of years. You see that sign that says they're like 27, and I don't know if it's supposed to be miles or kilometers. The unit of measure, I don't believe, was there on the sign. But the point is they're allegedly fairly close to the outskirts of London, when we're led to believe they're like maybe around the Canary Islands, around Morocco, or some place that would be third worldish enough that most of the major superpowers wouldn't really go to at that time, or Lithuania, I think, in that area up there. When we saw some of those early episodes, like, they're just not giving a shit about anything they up at all. The rover's gone. It just This is not a good way to end a show, and I think it serves one of two purposes. One, it's an easy way to kind of just end the show. Hey, we're done with it. We're trying to be smart. But two, I think it pissed people off enough where when these got rerun later, like in the United States, back like in college campuses and stuff, which you would get, midnight movies and weird shows like that being shown. People are like, whoa, this is high art. We don't really know what they're trying to say here, that it created some buzz. So I don't think McGowan deliberately tried to write a bad episode, but he literally wrote it in like 1 or 2 days. And I think he just said, you know what, I just got to tie this all together the best that I can, and that's it. And the show had already jumped the shark to me several episodes earlier. I thought they had a chance to get refocused here, but overall, like I said, I feel let down because some of these episodes are just phenomenal with the writing, and they're back and forth and everything else too. And this episode, I agree with you. I get what they were trying to do, and you could argue that they did execute it good enough because you understand what they're trying to do. And I just didn't really like it. And even the Beatles song, even though they were big time fans of, I think, McGowan or The Prisoner or whatever like that, they had that song there, "All You Need Is Love," which, or whatever it was. It's a nice little piece of pop culture, but is it really pertinent to everything?
No.
I think not. I mean, so
Mm.
yeah, I'm more
I could
disappointed, I think, than you are about this, because this is a first watch for you.
Yeah, and I could take the dim bones where 48 wouldn't stop singing. You could go ahead and take that as the parts of society. You could take a look into that. But All You Need Is Love is thrown in there because I like this Beatles song. And
Yeah.
a part of that is I did like, I'll admit, when they were explaining the types of betrayal, or what is it? Types of they have a specific word. But basically when they wake up, when they get out of the chain, and 48 is one of them because he's youthful, and then you have number 2, who is a respected member of society but wakes up to the horrors of it and realizes, no, I don't want this. This isn't what I want at all. And he fights against it. But then there's I mean, you could apply that to the vertically challenged butler. But the butler, I mean, I wish I had an exact way to describe it. He represents another almost surprising element. But then at the end, when McGowan is free and he drives off, the butler enters the house and the door opens just like in the village. And that's where you get, okay, the village is not, it's just an idea. The prisoner is simply his own prisoner, and he can't escape. And there is no end to the prison. Oh, whoop-de-doo. I really am just disappointed because at the end of the last episode, I was so excited. I had actual excitement because consequences meant something. But when we pushed into this one, it soon became apparent that it was nonsensical. And they try to be deep. And I guess you could say that they got there. But at what cost? We don't care about number 6 because number 6, he is just a number. He's never a real man. And he will always be the prisoner, and we are all prisoners stuck in an endless loop towards the suffering of this finale.
Yeah, and so just overall with the whole show, like I said, we know that the original was going to be maybe about half as many episodes, around 8, let's say, and then they extended it so they could have syndication rights and all that. So I understand all that. Not every episode's going to be great, but I still maintain that characters matter and count. And I know on your other channel where you're reviewing the current Lord of the Rings release, and me a couple episodes in, I think it's an absolutely horrible show, and I know you're enjoying it, and you explain why, and you go over that. And I talk about how you've got to early on, whether this character is going to be a good guy or a bad guy or whatever it is, you've got to let people watching it see what's going on and dive in. And to me, all the messaging and all the force stuff and early on in Lord of the Rings is readily apparent, and I'm sick of that. So to me, it made me not want to care because, when you try to dumb things down and make people look stupid in general, so, if you're the best of the worst, the way you would stand out in some situations, that's lazy writing and that's crap. And that's one of the issues that I have on the Extreme Movie Show when we talk about a lot of current things. But when you have something like The Prisoner, where we don't know who he is, we don't know why they want him, but we know it's against his will. So we get that primal, intuitive thing of, yeah, you want to get out. You want to break out of a prison that you're forced into. And when he's having conversations with people trying to fit in, and he realizes some of them are old enough or weak enough where they've just accepted their lot in life, where they're saying, you know what, they provide me a comfortable end to my existence. I'll submit. I will yield. And there's all these interesting dynamics. You can't really trust any of the women because they all turn on. One even ends up being a number 2, which I thought they could have done more with that later in an episode, and they didn't. But it's just one of those things where it really felt like it was going somewhere. And that's the whole point, is that from the very first episode, when we see the voiceover work, which is usually a different number 2, because we've had almost new ones, arguing or going back and forth with number 6, saying we want information, and he's like, you won't get it. And he's like, number 6 is saying, well, who's number 1? And he's like, you are number 6. And he's like, I am not a number, I'm a free man. And he gets laughed at. But the whole idea is that you are number 6 is apparent from the very first episode. So I don't feel like it's a big gotcha, but it's one of those smart things I think that they knew from the very beginning. And so at the end of the episode, it's like, well, if people have been paying attention to what's going on, everyone has to realize that this is, not an action spy episode of the week type of show, which can be very brain dead, check your brain and all that, just have some fun, some amusement stuff. And for God's sakes, we covered a recent episode where that an amusement park, which is kind of cool, but then with what we got used to at the beginning, kind of stupid. It was like, what the hell's going on? And it's one of those things where it's like, if you don't care about the characters, or even if you do, or damn it, you just want to know what's going to happen, give somebody that at the end. Don't just simply say, well, you are, because it's all in your head, and we'll just have the door magically open back to the flat that you drive back to. So subconsciously, if nobody's picked it out or somebody explains it to you later, you go, oh, the allegory is that the village is in your brain as well. That's not fulfilling on a logistical level. I get it, and I like it, and I like the trying to write up and be smart about it, like you said. But it's very frustrating, especially with where this was going. And it's very hard for a show when it gets about halfway through, when it either jumps the shark or tries to pivot, to really stay consistent. And that's where I feel the second half of this whole season of The Prisoner falters. What other observations do you have about the entire show in general?
The show itself has, I enjoyed a lot of the ideas behind it, and I made that very clear. I like science fiction. So when they went to extremes, I could dig it, as it were. But the political themes, I feel them, but yeah, I was more into the ideas and how they are pushing the theme. And so with that, I've been able to enjoy a lot of this series. I almost wish we did this month by month like we do for James Bond. Give us some
Right.
more space between episodes, because I cannot imagine when people would come in front of their television sets and watch a new episode of this, that they were enjoying it every single week. I just can't. I have to imagine that they missed some episodes, which you were ought to do when you can't record and you can't access it. So with that in mind, it's just I can't picture enjoying this going week by week by week, because you're in an endless cycle, and the series ends with that cycle never truly completing. Even with this big explosive ending, like, oh, give them machine guns, shoot them down, drive the truck, and dance to Dim Bones for half an hour. And it's sadly just never, it's a never ending cycle. And with that in mind, I cannot in my right mind say that anybody should binge this week by week or straight through. I feel like you need time to enjoy each episode, and never, for the life of you, watch Fallout as your last bit of The Prisoner. It's just, you're not going to like yourself anymore because you allowed this to happen.
It's, well, I think it depends, because television back in the day, there was a lot less of it produced, so it was a big deal. And look, taking the context in it, at least from an older person's perspective, like me, an '80s child, and you being, in your early 20s now,
Yeah.
what was different is that there's so much less stuff. A lot more times, people knew that certain things were on at certain times and got in the habit of scheduling around it. And with very little alternative programming, the competition for programming was more fierce than it is today. Here, you can just do the volume approach like Netflix and other places, just throw crap up there, and then you'll get some sort of people watching it, right? But back then, I think the overall quality was, and just generally speaking, was a bit higher, and it was a bit newer. But the effect of science fiction writers, like say on the original Star Trek, the original series, which is a very communist show in terms of what they're after. Even though the setup is a great vehicle for what they do and has great characters and interesting ideas we tweak. That had some fantastic science fiction writers and fantasy writers on the show, which now we don't necessarily have that. Oh my God, they're a hardcore sci-fi writer now, and now they're writing a TV pilot and trying to write as good as one as that you can get. That was a whole different thing. And we're going to talk a little bit later about how on the Extreme Movie Show, with, we talk about the '80s decade being the last real good decade of entertainment, not necessarily high quality writing, but there was definitely a boom from the '60s and '70s of fantasy, especially from Britain. And it started to fizzle out in the late '70s, early '80s. And when I think of The Prisoner, I know that you could only say so much about politics at the time, and to do so in a public manner like a television show, especially when some of the channels over in Britain are, and I'm speaking loosely here, not being obviously, being from the States, not from over there, that there's a lot of censorship, as it would be, or things you weren't allowed to put on over there in Britain. It was probably cutting edge at the time, because if they went a little bit more hardcore, it would probably have been a bit much for people to digest. But I do think that people would recognize, again, context here, Patrick McGowan, this is his baby, start to finish. But he already had Danger Man and Secret Agent Man. And a lot of people think this character here, John Drake, the spy, is basically him, because they never say his name. It's just a number. But he was turned down being James Bond. I mean, he was that big of an icon at that time. So this was not just a throwaway kind of series or whatever. And the fact that they didn't make it just a spy thing, I think, is a good thing. And it's one of the early shows that really does it, where it's not like, say, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. or some of the goofy, ones that were around in the '60s. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I heard yesterday that he turned down James Bond twice on a moral level. I haven't seen all of his work, so I don't know. But a lot of it came to do, like, he wouldn't kiss. Like, that was one of his major things. He insisted on not kissing for a role. That as well with Orson Welles apparently saying that he thinks that he could have been one of the great movie stars if he hadn't fallen into television and pretty much stayed there. And that's certainly, he's a great actor. I have no doubt about that. An intelligent man. He has a presence that's undeniable. He would have been a great Bond, I feel. But he is simply he has taken his child and shaken it.
Yeah.
And I feel like he could have done better. He could have done better.
It's hard to say that, but in a way it's true, just because of the way these played out. And I think, for me, one of the main takeaways for my closing thoughts on this whole show is, obviously, a lot of the filler stuff I don't remember nearly as much as I do the good stuff, and that's a shame, because there was a part of me when we talked about reviewing the show that it was going to be remembering all the stuff that was just like, when I watched it back in the 80s and then, in the early 90s, how cutting edge it was. And like you and I have covered, say, Twin Peaks, and while season 1 is a masterpiece to me, season 2, ABC fucked up, putting their finger into it and screwed things up. As bad as it was, there was some humor in it, and it still had enough momentum behind it that you could get through it. And then season 3 was definitely pretty interesting, kind of artsy in itself. When you've reviewed all those episodes and we've talked about how it's changed, and it's neat when somebody has the artistic freedom to do what they want with it. And for McGowan, we definitely got that here on the show. So I just, there's very few shows out there that would challenge, who you are as a human being and try and do so in a way that's through a spy
I
show.
I almost, if they went ahead, they do the final shot like it's the beginning of the episode. If they had gone ahead because they didn't start with it this episode and finished up with him going to the office, screaming again, going back and being drugged into sleep, and it faded to black there, I almost could have not enjoyed it, but at least it would have been more direct. And if you're going to be direct about it, don't beat around the bush. Just go ahead and walk through it and tell us what we want to know.
Yeah.
If we're screwed, listen, when we did Twin Peaks, I know towards the end we had some issues towards time travel and going to that, but it ends with a major what the hell. And
Yep.
that's how it's supposed to end. That is the essence of Twin Peaks. It makes sense.
Yes, it
And
does.
here, there's none of that. Nothing made sense. And when you lose that, you have made a mess. And I can't forgive that. I can forgive Twin Peaks season 2 more than I can forgive this ending of The Prisoner.
It's funny I brought up Lord of the Rings earlier because it's late 2022 as we're recording this, 9/11 actually. And Tolkien, I believe, was a Christian, had seen the horrors of
Catholic. Yeah.
war. And so the whole idea of him creating this whole universe, which is basically Christian themed with morals and everything in there too, is very important to him. And so I'd mentioned before, one of the issues with the current shows, I don't think they honor any of the source material at all. And not to go into a deep dive on the current Lord of the Rings and the problems I have with it or how you enjoy it, but to point out how it's similar to The Prisoner is that Patrick McGowan himself, I believe, was Roman Catholic, very spiritual person. That was probably one of the issues why he didn't want to kiss females or have any sort of sexual innuendo into it. Because James Bond, let's be honest, pure fantasy. It's what every
Yep.
guy would love to be, and it's escapism. Whereas The Prisoner is supposed to be a bit more moral based or Christian based in the sense of, you've got certain character elements. How strong do you believe in them? And so there's this issue of faith. Well, how much am I going to try to escape now that I can't seem to physically escape? How can I be subversive? And those were really interesting as they explored them. And in Tolkien's world, you saw some definite Christian elements to it, and some people would call it boring because of that, especially if you're, agnostic, atheist, satanic, whatever you want to call it, and that's fine. And Tolkien could always play that, well, I created it first card. Whereas, Patrick McGowan, I think, kind of could say that about spy shows, because while there are spy shows out there, they were just kind of like laugh, riot, goofy sorts of things or whatever. And unless you watch something like The Spy Who Came from the Cold, which is, very serious, dark type movie, it seems people really quickly forget the threat of communism taking over and the evils that come along with that in society, and nowhere more than Britain, who had pretty much been the superior country on the planet till around 1900 or so. Let's just say when America started to take over, you would think they would know better, and that's why with McGowan having lived through all that stuff too, and being a very passionate religious individual, I could see where he's going. Okay, I'm not going to make this too easy on the viewer. I'm going to try to write up, as you mentioned earlier, and so I agree with you. I understood what they were trying to do with everything going in the episode, but like I said, I just feel let down because they got away from the individual, the how strong of a character you have type of thing here, where it was more about what's the big picture, and that's not a bad thing, but it just they slapped it together in this two-parter with a bunch of that, and it really ruins it for me. And
Yeah.
while you and I debated on the order of the episodes, it kind of really doesn't matter to me,
No.
not at this point.
So no, it's funny that you mentioned that because that's a huge theme this episode. They go ahead and after the completion of the final ultimate test, they go ahead and say, you are the shining individual. Everything we did, you managed to fight off. You did this. You, oh, you, stand up, applause. And it makes a mockery of his individualism for fighting, to me, honestly. Like, yes, sure, he's his own prisoner, but him as a man, he's just going to, I guess he'll keep fighting, but there's nothing to fight. There is no bad guy.
There is
And
no tomorrow.
yeah, so it is simply the end doesn't matter. There is no end.
Yeah.
There's an idea of an end, but it will never be completed. And that is the prisoner.
Yeah, I agree with you totally. I mean, overall, I still think it's a great show, or had the potential to be one of the greatest of all time. Some great stuff in it. It's up there with like Twin Peaks season one with me being great. I just wish it was only about 6 or 8 episodes like Twin Peaks. I mean, really, if it did, man, this would be so much better to be talking about. But the thing that I'll close with this, and then I'll pass it over to you. I know we didn't agree on everything that was going on all the episodes, and that's cool. That's why we do this. It's fun to talk about. I think for me, it's a show that intellectually is very stimulating. That doesn't mean it's also entertaining and fun. Um, I would agree with you. It would be hard to binge unless you're in that mood. But what does surprise me about The Prisoner, despite what it seems like I've been bashing on it for about 20 minutes now, is that it does something that very few shows try to do. It definitely has a center to it. It definitely focuses on the individual, and the older I've gotten, the more surprised I guess I am, or shouldn't be, about how TV or movies or just things in pop culture have really gotten away from how powerful that is. And one of my favorite movies of all time is Rocky, and it's the underdog story, but they create characters. It's a love story that has boxing in it. It's not a boxing story, but you understand who these people are, what's going on with them. They're human. They're not superhuman. And so those kinds of things are very eternal and timeless. And I think The Prisoner did a good job of capturing some of those internal things, like strength of will, like individuality, like not conforming, or people forcing you to do stuff, that's against who you are and all that too. And I just wish they kind of stuck with that too. But today, you don't get that at all, hardly anywhere, and that's a shame. And that's one thing I'm surprised at. I can go, I can gripe a little bit about The Prisoner and some of the episodes and how this ending was, but at least it made sense, even if I wasn't crazy about it. But I just go, well, you know what? It's a hell of a lot stronger than a bunch of other things that started off pretty good and then turned to crap. And I know a lot of people had very divisive feelings about, say, Lost or other shows too, when they had no idea what the hell was going on either. So at least this had a clear beginning and end to it, where some things they write themselves in a position where they can't get out, and then they just go, "Oh, screw it, it doesn't really matter anyway," and that's frustrating. I feel, to your point, that McGowan really did attempt to deliver us a quality product, and I do respect the show and him for that a lot. And I'm surprised to say that after all this time, that I think those opinions are still very valid, and that's one of the main reasons to watch the show. It's very earnest in its depiction of what it's trying to do, despite some weird filler episodes. Your final overall thoughts on this whole show?
The betrayal of Lost and the betrayal of this are equal to me. At least with the beginning of Lost, with the mystery aspect, it had a story that progressed. There was no progression. And when there's no progression, and then you finally get to the idea of progression and you screw that, even that up, I am not going to say that this can be defended like Lost. I am dissatisfied by both, and my suffering continues to this day.
Well, to quote Major Garland Briggs from Twin Peaks, the achievement itself is its own reward. Meaning you don't just get something for trying something. The something is itself. And yeah, so it was definitely a very this show really struck a chord with a lot of people that would go on to do other things too. So to me, I felt like it was worth covering too. So it'll be interesting to see what show we decide to cover next on that too. But and any other final thoughts? Or are we good to close?
It's funny you say that, because there are a lot of great things that take the idea of the prisoner in individual aspects. Inspirations can fuel a certain series, like Wayward Pines, which
Yep.
I did love. And there are others that just aren't coming to mind, but they go ahead and take a concept and actually try to implement a story. So good for them.
Well, there you go. All right, ladies and gentlemen, final episode 17 of The Prisoner, 1967-68 with Patrick McGowan. Definitely an interesting show. Definitely one of those nerdy, intellectual type ones. And if you're one of those snobby types that likes to, get all high on yourself about it, it's definitely one of those kinds of shows. And surprisingly, there's not many of them like it. So there's a lot of good reasons to watch it, and you may have some very strong opinions about, like we did too. So it's one of those shows I can definitely clearly say it does not obloviate. It definitely does not obfuscate. It definitely has a very strong message, which just unfortunately gets lost a little bit along the way, especially with the execution at the end. But that being said, an entertaining watch from my perspective. So until next time, when we pick another show that we're going to cover for Professor Pixel, I'm your host Rob here on the Extreme Movie Show, aka Extreme TV, for our special Sunday night show here covering TV episodes. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I guess this is the final time, Pixel, and I could say, be seeing you.
Be seeing you.
Good night, everybody.